If you create a new virtual machine in Azure and you just click the entire process through and you're not caring about what options are actually selected, default VM will have a public IP address and port 339 is opened to the public, which is, by default, the worst thing that a system admin can think of.
One of the things that caused what we call VM sprawl is basically how easy it is to create a new instance of something.
Yes, exactly.
And when you do it on-prem, it's not a direct cost driver in itself, but it's not a direct cost issue.
With anything to do with rules, you have to police. You need to make sure that everybody who is responsible for creating virtual machines will apply the tags. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
It's not like the classic web shop or something where you say, I need a new SQL cluster for my environment. I click here and there, or do it with an ARM template, and then everything is connected, right? It's more like setting the boundaries.
But the problem is the fact that you can size VMs whatever size you like inside your own environment. But when you take that VM and move it into a cloud environment and power it on with those same resources, it becomes a very expensive machine indeed. Hello, everybody, and welcome along to this podcast. Today, we are lucky enough to be joined again by Alexander Scholz. Alexander was with us in the last podcast. Good afternoon, Alexander. Is it afternoon where you are? It probably is now. Pretty close. Yeah, pretty close. We know you're an IT consultant, but what do you consult for your people in Germany?
Azure infrastructure, a lot of governance-related things, pretty much also migration areas, and also operation parts, pretty much everything that is coming up in Azure.
Yeah, so you're like a proper cloud specialist from that perspective. It's
yes, and
certainly from what we were discussing on the last podcast, something you're really, really quite passionate about. It's it's your buttons to all intents and purposes, in the fact that you go out of your way to play with it even in your downtime to us, and look out for our home lab episode if you've not seen that. It's quite entertaining. This time, what we thought we'd talk about is a subject close to Alex's heart, which is Azure governance and landing zone. So to the layman then, Alexander, what would you say governance means to you when it comes to Azure?
Governance, easy set, is pretty much a rule set that is like created in the first step before actually going into Azure. That is pretty much comparable to the rule set that organizations have when they have infrastructure on-prem, for example. Most of the time it's not written down, but there are some sort of requirements, for example, that production systems need to have a backup, for example, and that web services need to have some sort of security layer around them. And this and a lot of other things are Azure governance parts.
Mm. Yeah, and I suppose the reason that this has been defined is because, well, certainly the way that the cloud was initially adopted a few years ago when it first came in, it was not adopted in that manner. People had structured methods by which they did things for their internal systems, but then they broke those rules when it came to cloud structure. Is that fair to say?
Well, not they broke them, but the thing is, on-prem infrastructure, you have just a limited amount of services that you can run. You have either virtual machines or Docker hosts or containers or whatever, or storage and so on. But with those hyperscalers, we are not talking about infrastructure only anymore. We have public IP addresses, for example. We have deep networking. We have in the default configuration a lot of systems that are open to the public by itself when you set them up. And it's part of our consultancy to actually shut them down again, because everything that's open to the internet is some sort of attack vector.
Absolutely. So it's more complexity, the fact that it's far more complicated using the cloud than it is utilizing stuff that's internal to the network.
Exactly.
And
at the same time, it's far more easy to spin things up that can then be compromised or be misused, basically, than it's on-prem. Right?
Yeah. For example, if you create a new virtual machine in Azure and you just click the entire process through and you're not caring about what options are actually selected, then default VM will have a public IP address and port 339 is opened to the public, which is by default the worst thing that a system admin can think of.
RDP access for everyone is a good thing. It makes it much easier.
Yeah.
What, to attack? Yeah, nice. Yeah,
that as well, yeah,
exactly.
Makes it
What
much
should
easier to
Jordan
attack.
find?
Yeah, we like to be kind to our ransomware attackers. I mean, we don't make life complicated for them. That would be horrendous.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But the thing also I think that ties into this is also that when we used on-prem virtualization solutions, we kind of, we as the general kind of IT people just, okay, well, we need a new VM, we'll just create it, next, give it whatever defaults are there with regards to resources and accesses and everything, right? It was one of the things that caused what we call VM sprawl is basically the how easy it is to create a new instance of something.
Yes, exactly.
And when you do it on-prem, it's not a direct cost driver in itself. It might utilize more resources than it should, which might compromise other systems, but it's not a direct cost issue. If you do the same in a cloud environment, just generate VMs that are too large with too much access, too much memory, too much disk space, that's an actual cost that you get billed. So you need to have a better governance around right-sizing those things. Also, when on the other end, you'll actually get billed for the exact usage you have defined.
I think that's a big thing with regard to lots of businesses tend to disaster recovery, or at least consider disaster recovery to the cloud, and that's great. But the problem is the fact that you can size VMs whatever size you like inside your own environment. But when you take that VM and move it into a cloud environment and power it on with those same resources, it becomes a very expensive machine indeed, far more than most people would think. So it's like, oh, it's got 8 CPUs, it's got 32 gigs of RAM, it's fine. Yeah, but stick it in the cloud, it's costly. So yeah, that's a real challenge for lots of people. But yeah, so does governance define sizing as well? Is it a rule for that?
It's part of it that you talk about VM sizes that are actually available for the customer, and also regions, for example. And then you can go even further and say, okay, for the RDP example that I mentioned earlier, you can deny it by default that public IP addresses are created for resources. That means, for example, if the customer needs one, it needs to be an exemption, and that needs to be done then separately. But it's impossible to just create a service with a public IP address and have some sort of a tag window open.
Yeah, agreed. You don't want the default to be that. And so the governance is about sort of setting up the environment in a secure way as best practice before you start building it. That sort of stuff. You defining your policy that says, oh, that this is how this will be done.
Yeah, there's an entire rule set or book called the Cloud Adoption Framework by Microsoft that is pretty much the best practice guide that you can follow. That has 3,600 pages, so that's pretty much a lot to read.
What?
But also on the other hand, it's not mandatory for everyone. That's like pretty much the best possible example that you can deliver. But not everything is suitable for everyone.
How many of your customers have read it?
None, I guess. Because that's my job to tell them what they actually need to look at and not read the entire 3,000 pages.
We all need an Alex. Is that what we're saying? We'll just can we clone you?
Definitely.
Is that doable? Yeah.
I don't know now, but maybe in future.
Yeah, maybe in the future. Yeah, that's definitely worth a go.
Depends on how much you put into those large language models in your home lab, I guess. We can just download a copy of that and we'll have an Alex. That's good.
But so that means you can define rules. You said like size, public IP addresses. Can you go so far as also define a naming concept? Because that's something that in the past often started very well, and then like 6 months after, it's like whatever, something like that. Possible?
Naming concept is a rough one. Even the people from Microsoft directly say if there's something that will be ignored, it will be the naming concept at some point. It's not entirely possible to enforce that at some point. it's still a valid method to tackle just resources, and for people that are not familiar with Azure to have some sort of insight about the stuff that they're actually seeing there. What is possible though is that you can, for example, use tags on resource groups, and all the resources within this resource group get the same tags.
Yeah. So, and there's a concept maybe that doesn't necessarily follow on outside of the cloud, but the idea of tagging something is you put a little bit of metadata bound to that resource that tells you maybe what it does, where it lives, who's managing it, which department it relates to, all this sort of stuff. So you can bind little pieces of text to objects so that you can then search for them and bill based upon them and various things like that, can't you?
Yeah. Like cost center is, for example, also a tag that is super, super important, because then you can actually, at the end of the month, you can actually try to look at the invoice and try to see what cost center is pretty expensive and needs to pay a lot of money, and how you actually want to calculate a user's amount of money that you need to pay as an infrastructure provider.
Yeah. But this comes down to policy as well, because you have to add those tags. They don't get added by default. Someone has to manually. Do you have to manually add them? Can you define rules by which they're added, or do you have to actually go to each resource and put a tag on it?
It depends. You can actually. It depends, like the usual IT answer.
It depends.
You can add them. You can add them by creation of resources, but you can also add them later on. Especially the part later on is something where you try to use tools and not just the portal. You go for infrastructure as code tooling, or at least PowerShell in that point. And of course, if you create resources, then the best way to add tags is when you create resources, because even, for example, for a virtual machine, it's not only a virtual machine object. There's a disk to it. There's a network attached interface, and therefore. All those resources get the same tags that you define on the virtual machine level.
Oh, indeed. Okay, good. But that again means that, and this is the thing with anything to do with rules, you have to police. So you need to make sure that everybody who is responsible for creating virtual machines will apply the tags. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Somebody, there has to be a sort of slap on the wrist to a certain extent if you don't apply the tags. Yes. Yes,
because like for example, if you don't have a policy or some sort of actually creating resources in a defined way, then I can just create a virtual machine and just leave the tags empty. Then I already surpass the system, which is not good in itself. For example, if I create ARM templates, pretty much some sort of infrastructure as code in a smaller way, I can say that's our way to deploy resources and virtual machines, and I can actually say that tags need to be added there. If the tag is not added, then the virtual machine will not get deployed.
Oh, right. So you can literally...
I can also do that.
Yeah. You can literally set dependencies. If it doesn't have a tag, it won't power on, sort of situation. That sort of stuff.
Exactly. Or it won't be created.
Well, that's the thing, right? Because you have to... It isn't enough to have a rule set of governance. You need to have a way of actually ensuring that it's applied as well. Without the other doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. So you need to have both.
And is it possible to, let's say you have different departments, have different rule sets, different possibilities for the people? Like developers they always need the best and greatest stuff. And maybe IT doesn't have the money to. Could be. Is it possible to change rules depending on the role that you're in?
Sure. Not depending on the role, but with what you could do, for as an example, is if you have a group of developers, for example, and they need more resources and a better virtual machine with more vCPUs and RAM, then you could create at least some sort of resource group for them, where you apply a policy that allows them more influence, or you can go even further and go for subscription. When you talk about subscription design and how to set up an infrastructure, or even bigger than a management group, for example. That's like the biggest thing that you can have, because one management group can contain multiple subscriptions. And then, for example, you can have your entire dev team split up on various workloads, for example, and they are allowed more resources there, specifically for this management group.
So you're almost setting up your dev team like a separate company within your organization sort of situation.
Pretty much,
build independently.
And pretty much. And also where you have to talk about then specifically is a role-based access concept, that not everyone is privileged the same way and not everyone has the full admin to break stuff. Then at least you need to talk about who needs access to what and what's the least amount of privileges that you can actually have.
And when you talk about such a management group, is it possible to, let's say, at the highest part of the hierarchy, put in like 2 tags or something that are needed, and then the lower you get on the subscription level, if it's special team, they have to put in another tag, and then on the resource group, it's yet another tag, so that you can really go on the hierarchical level for that stuff also?
Yeah, you could do that, yeah.
Okay, nice. So you can really gain visibility and have that flexibility that you need.
What do you think, Alex, is the okay? I think with certainly what we tended to see, this happened a lot, I suppose, with VMware when it first came out, is the fact that everyone starts this sort of stuff with the best of intentions, but then maybe doesn't maintain it. I mean, what's the point whereby you feel that's, I mean, short of naming convention, are there other areas whereby maybe it just drops off after a while? People lose interest in maintaining the same level of governance.
I think network part is one of those topics. Like what I've experienced a lot at customers, that they either had just very, very little security considerations in place, or had like pretty much no security, because they allowed any traffic from client to server network. And that is also something that you need to talk about in Azure, and especially when you follow the best practice way with a hub spoke setup and with a centralized firewall, you are talking about firewall rules again. You will run into the same issue like on-prem with DNS mistakes that will also follow you, regardless if it's super fancy cloud or not. And I think what is a big thing is that the customers actually need to develop a process that they are actually working with that platform. It doesn't help if we just, for example, set up a naming convention and then let it be. They have to work with it. Also, like cost situations, that they need to look at their resources and just sit there again and again. And they need to develop some kind of workflow.
Yeah. So it's so you almost need to. This needs to be a proactive process whereby, fine, you've had your cloud for 6 months. Then you need to sit, well, let's say, for example, once every quarter, you need to be sitting down and saying, right, are we keeping to our own rules? Do we need to change those rules? So it's constantly evolving, and people are constantly looking at it again with a fresh pair of eyes, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Like cloud infrastructure and itself, all the governance things are not fire and forget. They are not, it's just simply set up once and then you can ignore them. That's something that you actually need to follow and to work on like throughout the time.
When you go to customers, Alex, is it always greenfield, or is there some stuff in Azure already and then you have to somehow stamp on your governance? And how does that work?
The greenfield area is super rare nowadays. I think 90% of the time where you're actually talking to customers, they have some sort of infrastructure. Maybe not the entire best practice, hub and spoke, cloud adoption framework, landing zone, but they have at least some sort of subscription and the first services running there. And of course, then usually not in the best way with public endpoints here and there and exposed to the internet as much as possible. But you have to see what they have. And then, of course, my kind of approach is to first set up a separate infrastructure or a separate area that is guided and followed by the best practice approach. And then try to pretty much pull the existing resources into it. that they are also secured in a good way.
Yep, absolutely. Because it's very difficult. It'd be very difficult to try and merge the two, if that makes sense, without.
Exactly.
You mentioned it there. The landing zone is a term that's thrown around a lot. So how would you, if a layman came to you and said, "What the hell is a cloud landing zone?" How would you describe it, Alexander?
Again, easy description for it is pretty much it's the first area that a resource sees and gets presented when you create it. Of course, then there are different landing zones, from platform landing zone, where you talk about hub, spoke, centralized network, and so on, to application landing zones that have some sort of other requirements. But in the first place, it's just plain the first foundation that the resource sees when it gets created.
Okay, understood. So and I think that's maybe a very valid point. It's the fact that there's more than one type of landing zone. I suppose in my brain, to a certain extent, and I know this is incorrect, but in my brain, when it comes to cloud resources, I'm still thinking of virtual machine instances, network instances, things of that nature, subnets and that sort of stuff. Whereas I know full well that the cloud architecture has now evolved to the extent that we now, got separate database infrastructure or Office 365 infrastructure, and all this sort of stuff goes on alongside it. Serverless computing, and I'm sure so what we're saying is there's landing zones for each one of those. There's not one landing zone anymore. There's a landing zone for every different type of component that you could purchase, and the landing zone is what, like the best practice for that.
Pretty much, yeah, you can say.
So the landing zone then differs from customer to customer depending on their needs, or? Yeah,
it can be pretty simple, just a pure connectivity thing with a VPN tunnel, for example. But other customer, for example, has the situation that he needs some sort of SQL managed instance that needs to be created, and other services around it, from backup services to other parts. And that's specifically for application, then for that specific part. You try to encapsulate it so that not every workload is presented to other workloads, and try to narrow it down with a firewall, for example. That your SQL cluster is only able to talk to the specific application that it needs to talk to, and not that every system in your infrastructure can talk to the SQL cluster then.
It's not like the classic web shop or something where you say, I need a new SQL cluster for my environment. I click here and there, or do it like with an ARM template, and then everything is connected, right? It's more like setting the boundaries. Do I understand that correct? Okay.
Yeah, setting the boundaries is, perfectly described.
And that's somewhat different to an internal network. If you built yourself a SQL server, you probably wouldn't, and maybe I'm wrong on this one as well, you probably wouldn't limit that SQL server to be able to talk to one other server only in your switching infrastructure. You might set up a separate VLAN for it, but chances are you're going to put it on the network and allow multiple things inside your server network to talk to your SQL server. Is that right, Christian Moan? And I'm at the end of the day, yeah, it is, isn't it? You're not, but we're far stricter with cloud infrastructure. Is that what we're saying?
In the best way, yes. I mean, of course, there are customers that go the other way then, and they are trying to keep it as simple as possible so that anybody can maintain it. But in a perfect kind of scenario, you try to limit as much as possible. Like, it's pretty much network segmentation on-prem. It's comparable to it.
Yeah, but that's the thing, right? Because that kind of micro segmentation or network segmentation you do there is kind of built into the cloud environment. So you have the possibility to do that if you want to from day one. The problem, on the other hand, is on a local infrastructure. If you want to do that, you're either going to have to route the traffic out of the virtual machine host to a firewall and back again.
Yeah, and a pretty expensive firewall at that, I would imagine.
And those VMs might be located directly beside each other on the same host, but the networking has to leave and come back in order to be inspected and verified. Unless you do a virtual networking stack on-prem, which is, for the most part, an add-on to something. So it's something additional you have to buy and develop or deploy and configure. While in the hypervisor, that's in hyperscalers, that's already built into the networking stack you have access to. So it's more of a what's available and how can we utilize it in the best way kind of scenario, right? And that's why often on-prem environments doesn't have that, because no one has invested the time and effort and money into building that solution or in deploying that solution that allows you to do this on-prem.
Yeah, and apart from anything else, from a bandwidth perspective, you're also going to saturate NICs going out, because all traffic will be leaving the virtualized environment to go to a firewall to then come back into the virtualized environment to figure out where it needs to go. So you're going to have to design the architecture to do it.
Yeah, if you use a traditional way of doing that, that's what's going to happen. It's called hairpinning, right? So you kind of put the traffic out and back again on the same pipe, which is suboptimal. There are, as I mentioned, there are ways around it, but since it's not perhaps natively available in the hypervisor solution you're running, it's an add-on. It's something you need to add in addition to everything else. That is why it often gets overlooked.
Yeah, but the key thing that Alexander's pointing out is the fact that actually it's not that difficult to do inside a cloud environment, because a cloud environment is, well, it's virtualized and has that software built into it anyway.
And I think one more benefit is when you think about it like that and you have to define it anyways, then that helps you getting into the infrastructure as code scenario more, because then you can have your templates basically, and in your templates you always have the network security groups, you always have your external IP recommendations and stuff like that, and then you only have some small parts that you have to change. And as far as I understand, please correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, when you have the right governance, then you can check if those parts are already also implemented within the templates. And then you're basically, for every deployment, you're set with your rules within your boundaries from the landing zone. And then you can make it way easier to deploy things in a well-structured way, in a secured way for even the developers who don't maybe have that infrastructure knowledge, right?
Yeah. If you do it, for example, with the ARM templates, then it's easier to set up and to guide within the boundaries that you defined. With other infrastructure as code methods, it's a bit more difficult, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, and again, just from a layman's perspective, infrastructure as code, the premise being that essentially, rather than I suppose you're kind of used to going in and creating a virtual machine via an interface where you go in and say, oh, next, after selecting all the various elements. Infrastructure as code is that just encapsulated in a small script that says this is what the virtual machine will look like, and you then submit it and say, go ahead and build that, please. So you're just writing it like a programming language almost, rather than filling it in on the interface.
Which also ensures that it gets created the same way each and every time.
Yeah. So if you wanted to produce 50 different VMs, you could loop an infrastructure as code thing, just changing the name.
Yes, and that's one of the issues we've seen with on-prem environments, right? Is the ease of how you can log into a management system, create something, just typing in whatever and have it run without having a defined framework for how we're doing things. I see that in a lot of environments where you have, especially VMware environments that I work a lot with, right? To have kind of 300 VMs in an on-prem infrastructure. And those 300 VMs, they have 242 different sizings, right?
Yes.
But there are possibilities in VMware also to do stuff like that, right?
Absolutely.
But nobody's using it.
Absolutely.
People do use it. But the point is, I suppose that we're getting back to, if we're going back to Alexander's point about maintaining tagging and maintaining a defined policy on how we build things. If we go, rather than going to right, okay, Mr. Cloud designer, I want you to build machines like this, please, and giving them a selection of rules. What we're now saying is, write me a script and I'll validate the script. So it's almost like we're then checking text instead and just making sure they got it right. So we can almost create tools to check the text and make sure the text is in line with our governance. Is that what we're doing now? Rather than doing anything with an interface, it's all just text.
Well, if you, for example, use policies, Azure policies itself, then the way you're talking to Azure itself is text anyway. Even if you click in the portal, it still gets translated to the Azure Resource Manager. And everything that will happen then is, for example, if you create a resource, then it will specifically look for your requirement. And if the requirement is not met, it will not be created.
Cool. So but you don't really want to submit these things until you've checked them, do you? So do you have would you give it to a peer, have it peer reviewed before you submit it? Or are there tools you can run it through that say, if I did this, would it look right?
There's an audit mode, and also the enforcing of policies is not some recommendation of anyone that is working a lot with Azure. You first want to check if it's crying or mentioning that something is not right, and then if you can validate that the policy is built and the result that you have is as expected, then you can go further and actually start to deny things. But if you start to deny things, then it also just takes the ease of the deployment of resources.
Yeah, no, agreed. Yeah, no, interesting. But yeah, no, like I say, I think the infrastructure as code stuff is fascinating because it literally means that you've got, if we're using the term landing zone again, but if you build your landing zone, let's say, for example, you're building your landing zone in Germany, Frankfurt. So you've installed it there, great. It's worked fine. It's got all your virtual machines and it's got your SQL databases. It's got all your data. It's functioning normally and it's really secure. Great. Now, I want to mirror that to Stockholm or to England or to America. I want another one. Okay. Well, you just take all the text and you do it in another data center and say, go. And it rebuilds it for you. And I think that's absolutely fascinating with regard to that. And you're right. We don't do that internally enough. We can, but we don't. So yeah, it is quite really powerful with regard to structure.
What's the biggest mistake you can do with regards to governance and landing zone development?
I think it's really a networking mistake that is actually causing a lot of trouble afterwards. If you didn't think about network segmentation and how many IP addresses that you are actually needing for specific workloads, because whenever a resource is created in a subnet, you need to detach the network interface before you can actually modify the subnet. And that creates some sort of problem if you need to make it bigger afterwards because you realize, okay, maybe I ran out of IP addresses. That's one part. And also, I would say the different kind of settings for your virtual machines. If there's no standard, then every virtual machine will look different compared to on-prem with the machine sizes, for example. But there are also so much config things that can be defined, from disk encryption to boot diagnostic settings that can be sent to a work analytics workspace, for example. There are so many things that you can actually make mistakes that you need to pay attention.
Absolutely.
As I've mentioned, I think in several episodes, the automation part of this, the way you can automate everything, also makes it possible to screw up at scale, right? So
yes.
if you do something really bad, it'll replicate quickly if you do it programmatically. So be aware of that as well.
Yes, destroy faster. It's the way forward.
If you did it right, you can scale back also.
Yeah, that's true. Yes, roll it back would be good. If we can go around the table again, what I would say, I suppose, if there's one piece of advice that you could give your customers who are maybe using the cloud or are looking to use the cloud, if there was one piece of advice you would give, Alexander, to those people with regard to governance or landing zone.
I would recommend to talk about it repeatedly. And develop a workflow and a time frame and so on the system that you're forced to talk about it and forced to think about how you can approach and maybe modify things, and that it's not just set up and that you can actually forget it. Because that's what I see a lot, that people and companies just set it up, but they're not talking about it again and again and again. And for example, best practices for their infrastructure and how they could do things better. And that's something that's really important.
Yeah, agreed. Christian Lehrer?
I think it's basically the same as with security, only because a hyperscaler gives you the infrastructure doesn't mean they are responsible for it. You as a company or as an IT group in a company are still responsible for it. So you have to make your thoughts about it. And not only from the usability side, also from the cost side. I think Azure governance can be a great helper when it comes to cost management and keeping that cloud cost in a good ratio between cost and takeaway.
Christian Moen.
As the kind of on-premises guy here, I guess I'll spin it around a bit and say that have a look at those governance documents from Azure and from everyone else, and see how you can incorporate those into your on-prem environments. Use the same concepts, use the same ideas, but use those best practices guides that has been developed for Azure or GCP or AWS. And see if there's something there that you can use on your on-prem environment as well. It'll help you manage and kind of not have your on-prem infrastructure as dynamic or as fluid or as weird as you want it, but it'll help you also with how you manage your on-prem stuff and how you should manage it.
Yeah.
And utilize the same kind of infrastructure as code concepts and way of sort of doing that, because that's also possible on-prem.
Yeah.
So best of both worlds. You can use it both ways.
I'm going to say, and I'll mirror the infrastructure as code elements. I think the key thing with all of this is it's about having a structured approach to what you do, and that can only ever be a good thing. And so I think infrastructure as code, while can be a cascade issue, I suppose, but on the whole, I think it's a very positive thing. So yeah, utilize it both in the cloud and on premise if you can. Okay, great, guys. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alexander, for joining in. Really enjoyed that, and really insightful stuff about the cloud, which we don't tend to mess with too much. So excellent. Thank you.